April 15, 1912, was a dark day for the passengers aboard the RMS Titanic. After scraping against an iceberg at 11:40 p.m., the ship slowly sank into the frozen depths of the Atlantic, and over 1,500 unfortunate souls lost their lives. Built to be unsinkable, the ship was considered the pinnacle of technology and design. But none of that mattered, as water flooded the ship's compartments, bringing it down in less than 3 hours. Today, we're taking a look at everything that went wrong to sink the Titanic. But before we get started, make sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel. And don't forget to leave a comment and let us know what other infamous events you would like to hear about next. Okay, time to make some room on that big floating door and find out what went down when Titanic went down. One of the perks of being a luxury ship meant being equipped with the latest technology. In 1912, that technology revolved around the radio telegraph. Made by Marconi Technology, the state-of-the-art equipment was overseen on Titanic by Marconi employees Jack Phillips and Harold Bride. However, that cutting-edge radio tech was mostly used by the ship's wealthiest passengers to send personal messages. That's like using the emergency broadcast system to text your butler. Bride and Phillips spent most of their time relaying these vital personal messages at the behest of the upper class. As the ship cruised on, their communications were occasionally interrupted by other ships warning them of possible icebergs along the Titanic's path. You know, boring stuff like that. Bride and Phillips took these in stride, passing some of the warnings on to the captain. The captain, displaying the kind of leadership that guarantees your place in history as the captain of the most famous sunken ship of all time, effectively ignored the warnings. He only changed course slightly and maintained the ship's speed. In total, the Titanic received 7 messages about the iceberg. The final message even contained specific coordinates of the location where the ship ultimately struck the iceberg. Listen, we get it. It was an honest mistake. Nobody can be expected to walk all the way to the captain's office to relay every single iceberg warning some rando sends you. The ship began transmitting distress signals half an hour after striking the iceberg. The Marconi signal on the ship was so powerful that it reached many other ships and even some areas on land. But there was only one line, which limited the communication. Signals from all sources came through at once, resulting in a cacophonous storm, like a podcast with more than one host. Chaos erupted as the Titanic's radio operators continually tried to message nearby ships. To make matters worse, the crew didn't know their exact location and were likely providing incorrect coordinates to potential rescuers. Amateur radio operators on the land tried to respond as well, creating more interference and resulting in false reports. Imagine if 911 was a party line. And that's the gist of what happened. In the wake of the disaster, governments around the world began limiting the operating power and reserving certain frequencies for emergency purposes. This spawned the radioactive 1912, which required all seafaring vessels to maintain 24-hour radio watch and keep contact with coastal radio stations throughout their journey. Every seafaring vessel requires a lookout to help prevent collisions while traveling. Even with modern breakthroughs like radios and GPS, sometimes you just need a vigilant pair of eyes to keep watch. You know, for things like icebergs and, I don't know, treasure? The Titanic had 2 lookouts during its ill-fated trip, Charles Lightoller and George Symons. It makes sense to issue your lookouts binoculars, but officers saw things very differently in 1912. It was believed that the lookouts would waste time using binoculars to identify ships and other light sources instead of using them to spot impending collisions. Wouldn't want to run the risk of the lookouts goofing off, which is apparently what you do with binoculars while in the middle of the ocean. Consequently, David Blair didn't think much of locking the binoculars up and taking the key with him when he was replaced by Symons. Symons went looking for a pair, but was told by Lightoller that none were available. However, Lightoller later explained during a U.S. Senate inquiry that there were 5 other pairs of binoculars on the ship. Why was everyone so uptight about binoculars? Maybe they were full of heroin or something back then? Like old-timey medicine? Obviously, no one can say for certain. But binoculars might have helped the Titanic's lookouts spot the iceberg sooner. In the end, that lack of preparedness only contributed to the ship's downfall. In 2007, Blair's original key, the one that locked up the fateful binoculars, was auctioned for a staggering £90,000, or approximately $117,000, alongside other Titanic-related items. That had to be James Cameron, right? Who else drops $100,000 on a Titanic rummage sale? True to its name, the Titanic was big as hell, and it was cruising through the Atlantic at a pretty good clip. The 882-foot-long ship traveled at 22 knots that night. Slowing the ship down would not have been fast or easy. That's like sending a Winnebago down a water slide and jumping on the brakes halfway down. When the lookouts finally did spot the iceberg, First Officer Murdoch ordered the engines to be put in full reverse. But there was a problem. The ship's rudder was far too small for a vessel of its size. The White Star Line didn't believe the ship required a larger one, assuming it wouldn't need to navigate around too many obstacles. When you build a boat that big, you sort of expect it to carve through the ocean like Jerome Bettis. To put the engines in full reverse, the ship needed to slow its propellers down, then fire them back up in the opposite direction, which took time. Worse, the ship's central propeller couldn't turn in reverse, meaning the ship had less power to travel in reverse than it did moving forward. In simpler terms, the Titanic had roughly the same maneuverability as an airborne bus. In the end, by the time the crew spotted the iceberg, it was far too late. Not even their best efforts were able to steer the ship away from its grim destiny. For over 70 years, the Titanic quietly rested in its watery grave. It was assumed the ship sank fully intact, and the disaster was blamed on the captain's decision to sail through icy, dark waters at high speeds, or the hull's metal becoming brittle in the frigid temperatures. That thinking all changed when Robert Ballard located the ship off the coast of Newfoundland in 1985. The discovery of the wreckage and the fact that Titanic had apparently broken apart as it sank brought those initial assumptions into question. Experts began looking at the Titanic's engineering, hoping to discover if the ship's construction had somehow contributed to its fate. Two scientists, named Jennifer Hooper McCarty and Tim Folk, suspected the hull's rivets may have been weak. As it turns out, many rivets recovered from the wreckage had high amounts of a smelting residue called slag, indicating that they were made from a lower quality iron rather than steel. McCarty and Folk later learned that White Star had used the iron rivets to save time and labor costs in order to have the Titanic and its two sister ships constructed simultaneously. Both the bow and stern of the ship were built using the iron rivets. You can probably see where this is going, unlike Titanic's lookouts. McCarty and Folk theorized that the lesser quality rivets simply popped right out when the iceberg collided with the ship. The seams ended up bursting, allowing water to flood the vessel and bring the whole thing down in record time. But shoddy rivets were only one aspect of Titanic's structural issues. Previously, experts believed the ship snapped in half as the bow sank and lifted the stern 45 degrees out of the water. Based on the evidence, that would have looked totally bitchin'. Most paintings and a certain James Cameron film depict the sinking in this manner. The reasoning was that the pressure and weight was too much for the ship's expansion joints, ultimately causing Titanic to dramatically snap in half like a doomed biscotti. Reality is, of course, much stranger than fiction. Two researchers studying the wreckage discovered the precise point where the hull split and broke into two. Naval architect Roger Long explained this discovery meant the stern's angle wasn't 45 degrees at all. Instead, it was more likely around 11 degrees as the ship sank. Learning that the expansion joints failed at such a low angle meant the ship might have eventually broken apart during more common situations too. For instance, a severe storm might have blasted Titanic apart just as swiftly as the iceberg did. Or maybe even a particularly intense shuffleboard tournament. They can get rough. Titanic had 16 watertight compartments that would close in the event of a flood, which was an impressive design feature for its time. The compartments were supposed to contain water in the event of a hull breach. These compartments, along with general hubris, were the reason the ship was believed to be unsinkable. Unfortunately, the compartment's design facilitated the spread of water instead of stopping it. The walls separating each compartment didn't reach from floor to ceiling, probably to allow for more cargo space. So in actuality, they were less like watertight compartments and more like bathroom stalls. That seems like an oversight. Maybe get some grout in there. When the crew closed the watertight doors to contain the flooding, the weight of the water inside the containers caused the bow to pitch downward. That precarious angle allowed the water to flow over the compartment walls, eventually filling them up one after the other. Historians generally agree this design was stupid. A few things had to line up perfectly in order to place a big ol' iceberg in Titanic's path that night. As icebergs move from Greenland to the Atlantic, they often melt before making it to the ocean. Only about 2% of icebergs make it that far, and that trip can take several years. But in 1912, the weather was a bit off. Records from the time point to an unusual amount of icebergs arriving intact in the North Atlantic that year. Mild winters have been to blame. Perhaps the strange weather made the current stronger, eventually pushing icebergs further out. Other researchers believe high tides that year allowed icebergs to float into the ocean. Or maybe they were all gathering for Coachella. Historian Tim Moulton suggested that optical illusions caused by light refraction might have also contributed to the collision. After meticulously studying the ship's logs, weather records, and survivor testimonies, he developed a theory that suggested the temperature may have dropped as the ship traveled from the Gulf Stream to the Labrador Current. Frigid water in the current would have cooled air from the water's surface, possibly resulting in a thermal inversion. Thermal inversions are known to cause superior mirages that are especially treacherous at sea because they make distant objects appear closer and the horizon seem higher. The lack of a moon that night might have also caused danger to the ship. No light existed to highlight any issues on the water's surface. As we already covered, Titanic's rascally lookouts had their binocular privileges revoked for the evening. Acts of God were not the only unfortunate coincidences at work. The Board of Trade didn't adjust Titanic's safety requirements despite its immense size, which led to the ship's insufficient number of lifeboats. Captain Edward Smith allegedly allowed lifeboats to leave before being filled to capacity. Smith also failed to issue an order to abandon the ship or give any instructions for evacuation. As the ship sank, the nearby Californian, which was only 10 miles away, mistook Titanic's emergency flares for fireworks and had turned their radio off. Apparently, the operator was tired of listening to messages about some first-class passenger's sick poodle and went to bed for the night. So what do you think? Could the sinking of the Titanic been prevented? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.